Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned the honor and privilege of your subscription. And of course, to everybody who's watching out there, if you enjoy or appreciate this video, it'd be great if you would take a second or two to click that thumbs up button down below, because that's what tells YouTube to promote my videos to more people with similar interests. And the more people watching my videos and commenting, the more we can learn about building guitars, because really it's the comments section that can be a goldmine of information. But in order for it to work, we need more people watching and commenting. You can also, if you'd like to help support my channel financially so that I'll make more videos about building guitars, as well as reviewing the tools that we use to build guitars, you can visit my eGuitar Plans web store or my Highline Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below. And no matter what you purchase, that will help to support this channel financially. And of course, if you want to keep it real simple, you can just click that thanks button down below and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. Okay, so what I was going to talk about in today's video is I am going to do the finish sanding on this guitar neck. So I'll show you that whole process. And then I'm going to install the side marker dots. So we've got a lot to cover in this video. Let's jump in and get started. In previous videos, I've mentioned that I try to machine all the parts for my guitars to a point where I can sand them with 220 grit sandpaper, but that isn't always the case. There are going to be some spots, some areas on the surface of the parts that require a bit more aggressive approach. And so here I'm using my oscillating spindle sander to sand some of those areas with 150 grit sandpaper in order to remove the tool marks. I have my spindle sander as well as my belt sander bolted down to the top of one of my flip-top tool stands. And if you want to build one of these tool stands, you can visit my eGuitar Plans web store or my Highline Guitars merch store and purchase the plans to build one. Then on the other side, I have a downdraft table, which I built. Now, I don't have plans for the downdraft table, but if you buy those inserts, and I'll put a link in the description below, they usually come with a set of plans so that you can build your own. It's really simple. But I'll hook up a 4-inch hose to my dust collector, and this downdraft table does a great job of keeping the dust to a minimum. When it comes to sanding, I'm going to be starting out with probably 150 to 220 grit sandpaper, and then I'll work my way up to 320 and then 400 grit. And I like to use a lot of different types of sanding blocks to do this work. And here I'm using it's about a 1/2-inch diameter oak dowel. But I also will use wooden blocks, and I really like to use those cheap dollar store giant erasers. And again, I'll put a link in the description below if you'd like to purchase one. But they're great for sanding necks because they'll conform to the shape of the neck, and it makes it really easy to get a super smooth surface. The type of sandpaper that I use is mostly 3M sandpapers, but I try to use P-grade sandpapers. And you can tell they're P-grade because in front of the grit designation, it'll have the letter P. And that's the European standard for abrasives. And they've become really popular even here in the United States because P-grade sandpapers use abrasive grits that are very consistent in size, so you get a very uniform and consistent scratch pattern with each grit, and that makes it really easy to remove the scratches when you go from, say, 220 to 320 and then on to 400. And that's really what I'll be doing with this neck. I'll start out with the 220 or the 150 in some of the more difficult areas, and then I'll work up through 220. Then I'll switch to a 320 grit sandpaper, and then I'll follow that with some 400 grit. And usually at around 400, maybe even sometimes 600 grit, that's enough to generate a surface which doesn't have a lot of visible scratch marks. You know, once you get past 400 or 600 grit, it becomes increasingly difficult to see those sanding scratches. So it really, what it comes down to is testing your finish. As I've mentioned before, you should always test the finish that you're going to use on scrap wood, but you can also check to see how that finish is going to lay down over wood that's been sanded at consistently finer grits of sandpaper. And you may decide that at 400 grit you can still see the sanding scratches, so when you actually go to sand the workpiece, you might want to take it all the way to 600 or even 800 grit. And then also testing is going to let you see how well that finish adheres to a surface that's been sanded really, really smooth. A lot of YouTube woodworkers will tell you you should always sand in the direction of the grain. And that's true if you're going to be stopping at 220 grit, because sanding with the grain up to 220 grit keeps the sanding scratches running in the same direction as the grain, so it becomes harder to see that when you apply finish. However, since I'm taking it up to a much finer grit, which guitar players expect, I can sand in any direction. And then one thing I like to do is to check my progress against a bright shop light. This helps me to see flaws in the surface, sanding scratches, tool marks that have escaped detection. That's really important with maple because it's difficult to see. I also like to use a shop light that I can hold over the workpiece as I rotate it, and this helps me to see flaws, especially where light meets the shadow. Once I've finished sanding and I'm satisfied with the surface quality of the wood, it's time to move on to the next thing, which is to install the side marker dots. And the dots that I'm going to install is basically the same as the dots that I did on the front of the fretboard, and that is to mix up some glow-in-the-dark powder. I'll mix it with epoxy, and then I'm going to fill holes that I'm going to drill in the side of the fretboard. So the way that I do this, this is not the method that I would necessarily recommend to a lot of beginners, because it does take some experience and skill to do it. But I typically position the marker dots visually. I don't measure. It's really not necessary. I can get it pretty accurate just going by eye. But I'll mark a center line down the thickness of the fretboard, and then I'll indicate where I want the marker dot to be, and I'll use a center punch to mark the position. Then I'll go back with a drill and a 3/32 inch drill bit and drill just a shallow divot where I want that marker dot to be. Now, as I said a moment ago, I'm going to use glow-in-the-dark powder that's been mixed into epoxy. And I'm going to use 30-minute epoxy for this because it gives me a decent amount of working time. Some guys like to use powder that they'll take their glow-in-the-dark powder and they'll sprinkle it into the hole, and then they'll put a drop of CA glue on it, which will soak in and cure instantly so they can keep working. But the problem with that is I found that when you use CA glue with any kind of powder, whether it's glow-in-the-dark or any other type of powder, a mica powder, for example, what happens is the CA glue will mix with the powder, and then it will bleed into the surrounding wood. But if you use epoxy, it won't bleed into the wood. It stays put in the hole that you put it in. So I prefer to use that on marker dots. It does seem to work much better. The only disadvantage is it's going to take several hours for it to fully cure before I can proceed with sanding down the epoxy level with the sides of the fretboard. And when you use epoxy, especially if you mix a pigment into it, there's always a chance that you could get some air bubbles in the epoxy itself that will dry there, and when you sand it down, they're exposed. So what I'll do is I'll take a lighter, a butane lighter, and I'll just touch it very quickly to each one of those dots. And what that's going to do is the heat will pop those air bubbles, and it also allows the glue to thin slightly and then spread out to fill the inside of the hole. Just because it's 30-minute epoxy doesn't mean it's going to dry in 30 minutes. It's actually going to take about 6 to 12 hours to dry and cure. But once it's done, I'll take one of my Japanese Iwasaka files and knock down the highest spots on those marker dots. Then I'll come back with 220 grit sandpaper and sand the surface so that it's smooth and each dot is flush with the side of the fretboard. Then I'll go back and hit it with 320 and then 400 grit sandpaper to make it match the same surface quality as the rest of the neck. Okay guys, well that's all the time I have for this episode. What I plan to do in the next episode is I'm going to apply finish to this guitar neck. And I'll be using my Faithful Standby that I have been using on a lot of my recent builds over the years. And that is polymerized tung oil. And specifically, I'm using products from Sutherland Wells. So be sure to check out that video as I apply the finish. And then hopefully, if there's time, I'll go ahead and install the frets. And at that stage, I'll be able to set the neck aside. And then in future episodes, I'll make the body for this guitar. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and got something out of it. If so, please click that thumbs up button, visit eguitarplans.com, visit Highline Guitars merch store, click the thanks button, leave a tip. And until the next episode, as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for more future guitar building videos.